And if you haven't noticed the name connection, how are you related to the gentleman who will be a focal point of our story today, the Battle of Albuera? We're going to talk about General slash Marshal Beresford. Can you explain your relation to him?
Well, Marshal Beresford is only a distant relative, but we do have a common ancestor in that my direct ancestor and the Marshal had a common grandfather.
Okay. So the battle we're going to talk about today is the single bloodiest day in Peninsular War, the Battle of Albuera, which was fought May 1811. Why was this battle particularly brutal in a war known for its brutality?
Well, the casualties were so high because two English brigades and one Spanish or part Spanish division of infantry in particular exchanged fire for several hours with two French infantry divisions, which were supported by artillery and by lancers. And the lancers played a significant part in this battle as well. Obviously, we'll discuss the casualties further when dealing with the outcome of the battle, but an important factor was that the French had a substantial superiority in cavalry. Extremadura, which is where Albuera is, this is the province of Spain, was excellent cavalry country. And in this, it was very different from most of the other battles fought in the peninsula. Bussaco, Porto, Vitoria, Pyrenees, Nives, Nivelles, Orthez, Toulouse, none of those did cavalry play any significant part. Indeed, the only other major battle in which cavalry played a significant part, a very significant part, was, of course, the Battle of Salamanca in 1812. So there at Salamanca, the Allies actually had a superiority in cavalry, superiority in numbers. But here at Albuera, that position was reversed, and Marshal Soult had a very definite majority in cavalry.
And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But I want to provide some background for our listeners on how we get to this point in Albuera. In an effort to enforce his continental system that prevented trade with Britain, Napoleon had invaded Portugal in 1807 and then attacked his former ally Spain in 1808. How was the Peninsular War going for the Allies and Napoleon in the 3 years between 1808 and 1811?
Well, of course, in 1808, the British forced the French out of Portugal, and that was the end of the first French invasion of Portugal. And they did so with some assistance from the Portuguese. After victories at Roliça and Vimeiro, the British entered, of course, the contentious Convention of Sintra, which allowed the French to return home. Now, I would just take issue with what some people say it was a total disgrace. It wasn't, because these conventions were very much the norm at that time. For instance, when the British had defeated the French in Egypt, they actually sent the French army home to France. Likewise, when Whitelock was defeated at Buenos Aires, the army was allowed to return home to England. So there was a history, custom, and practice permitting this. But anyhow, what was really contentious was the French did manage to smuggle home a considerable amount of loot when they went back to France. And the Portuguese themselves were outraged that they had never been consulted about the convention before it was entered into. But be that as it may, 1809 saw the second French invasion under Soult of northern Portugal. In response, Wellesley, as he was then, Wellington as he was to become later, was sent out with an army, came out from Cork, actually, from Southern Ireland, to remedy the situation, if we can put it like that. So, 1809, Wellesley, first of all, defeats Soult and pushes him back out of Portugal into northern Spain. Significant, but didn't conclude the war in any significant way because, of course, the French had a number of generals in Spain, a number of divisions, a number of armies, a number of corps, and no sooner had he dealt with Soult at Porto than Wellesley had to go south to meet the General Jourdan and Victor and King Joseph, whom he defeated again at Talavera, but defeated in such a way that after the battle, it was Wellington who had to retire into Portugal because he couldn't take on the numbers. The simple fact was the French had so many more troops in Spain than Wellington had at his disposal. Meanwhile, Beresford had arrived out in Lisbon in March 1809 at the request of the Portuguese government for a general who would come and train and build their army. Why did they need to build up an army? Simply because during the first invasion under Junot, General Junot actually, under that first invasion, he had completely demobbed the Portuguese army, and he took the only good regiments, there were only a couple of really good regiments, and he sent them to fight for Napoleon in Northern Europe. And they did that for a number of years until, unfortunately, they suffered horrendously in the invasion of Russia in 1812. So the rest of the army, Junot disbanded, quite simply. And there was no army when Beresford got to Portugal. The Portuguese had tried after the Convention of Sintra to reassemble some of their troops, but they realized they weren't doing it. They couldn't train them. So Beresford is sent over by the British Army. And what he does is, I mean, he's a very sticky disciplinarian. We'll come on to that probably. But what he does is he trains the Portuguese army according to the British regulations. And that is most important because not very long after, within a year, Wellington is so confident in what he sees that he is putting Portuguese regiments in the line with British regiments because he knows they understand and they will do what they're told. And in the third invasion, 1810, under Massena, is the biggest invasion that Napoleon authorizes for Portugal. And probably one of his best generals, Marshal Massena, comes with a huge force, originally about 80,000, but probably by the time he gets into Portugal, only about 65,000. He'd had to garrison Ciudad Rodrigo, which he'd taken on the way, garrison Almeida, which he'd taken on the way, these border fortresses. But, of course, 1810 saw in September, he reaches into Portugal and he meets Wellington at the Battle of Bussaco. Bussaco, for those who haven't been there, is a very, very steep hillside with a hell of a ridge at the top. Wellington did his usual trick of hiding his army until the French, who had struggled up. I mean, I would hate to come up that hill with people firing down at you.
Yeah, with full packs going up that hill, yeah, for sure. On the French side, it's not going well for Napoleon. Obviously, you mentioned the Convention of Sintra. Junot is kicked out. Soult in the second invasion of Portugal is kicked out by Wellington. So this is now the third invasion with Massena, who's one of his best generals. It's not going that well. It has a few initial successes, but Bussaco and Fuentes de Enoro, which you're coming up to probably, it's not progressing like Napoleon wants it to.
No, I mean, Bussaco was no doubt was a defeat for Massena, but Massena still has a very large army. And he works out that he can go round the side of Wellington, and he does outflank him, and Wellington has to retreat, and does so to the prepared lines of Torres Vedras. And this is these defensive lines which stretch from the Atlantic to the River Tagus, right across the peninsula, effectively protecting Lisbon. And Massena realizes very quickly that he cannot break through. And he sits down thinking he's going to starve the Anglo-Portuguese into submission. But of course, he's the one who gets starved because the English and the Portuguese are being fed by boats coming in from Britain and Ireland with food all through the winter. And come March 1811, Massena decides to retreat. And he retreats all the way back into Spain, harried by Wellington's army. Just to give a call out for how terrible this was for the Portuguese. Most estimates reckon that between 10 and 20% of the Portuguese population died during these wars. That's a huge number. And perhaps 40,000 civilians died in the third French invasion alone. So it gives you some idea. But of course, what had happened was, demonstrably, was that Napoleon had failed in his attempt to drive the English leopard back into the sea.
Correct. Yes. And with outdated information, though, Napoleon sends Marshal Soult to aid Marshal Massena to kind of draw forces away from the lines of Torres Vedras. Now, Napoleon didn't know that Massena was already withdrawing. So Marshal Soult starts marching towards Portugal. I want to talk briefly about the two commanders in this upcoming battle. We're going to talk about Beresford and Marshal Soult. What kind of commanders were they?
Well, both were very strict disciplinarians. They certainly had that in common. Soult had been put in charge of, I think it was the Fourth Corps, for the projected invasion of Britain in 1804, 1805. And he'd put his stamp on that army, which was subsequently used to go into Eastern Europe. But he'd certainly shown he was a very strict disciplinarian at that occasion. Beresford's discipline had been shown. First of all, he'd been appointed colonel of the Connaught Rangers, an Irish regiment in the British Army, which had only been established in 1793. And in 1795, Beresford had been made colonel of it at a time when it was at a particularly low ebb. At a low ebb because of disease contracted in what was called the Low Countries then. Typhus, typhoid, malaria, you name it, it existed there. And the regiment, which had gone out 1,000 strong, had come back with about 200 effectives. And at that stage, Beresford was appointed the new lieutenant colonel. And all the people who've written about it, in the sense of the people who were there at the time, noted about his discipline, his training, and how effective this was. So he and Soult shared that in common, this approach to discipline. Soult, of course, was far more experienced in handling large numbers of battlefield formations. I mean, he'd commanded divisions at Austerlitz, Eylau, Jena, and Beresford had actually done nothing like that up to this time. He had commanded relatively small regiments and brigades. One significant encounter had been in Egypt. He'd commanded a brigade in Egypt which had marched from the Red Sea to assist Abercrombie in Egypt, up around Cairo and Alexandria. Now, he actually arrived too late, but curiously enough, that march across the desert led to him being very highly thought of, and it was much publicized at the time. He'd also commanded brigades in South Africa, Madeira, and again on the retreat to La Coruña. The retreat to La Coruña in December, January 1808, 1809, Beresford had commanded the rearguard after the battle when they were trying to board the vessels. In fact, he thought he wouldn't get off. I've seen a letter of his to a member of the family where he said, "I don't expect to get out of here. The next time you're going to hear from me, I'll probably be a prisoner of the French." But he did get out. He got onto the boat. His regiment was the last one onto the boat at La Coruña. So he'd got experience of battles, all right. The appointment to command the army to relieve Badajoz, because that's what they thought they were going to do, relieve a French siege of Badajoz in 1811, was a reflection of Wellington's trust in him.
Looking at Soult and Beresford, they both are good organizers, both good trainers of men. But maybe Soult has more experience than Beresford, and like you said, large formations and battle formations than Beresford. But it sounds like they're very similar men.
Yeah, I mean, both of them got on very well with their men, in fact, with the troops, notwithstanding that they were disciplinarians. And another thing which we'll come on to, I suspect, is both had problems sometimes handling troops in the middle of battles.
Yeah.
When we come down to the Battle of Albuera, there will be one important distinction, which is that it was the first time in the Peninsular War that three nations, the English, the Portuguese, and the Spanish, had fought under a unified command. And it wasn't that easy. I'll just put it there. Now, there were differences, I would say, between Beresford and Soult. Please don't think I'm saying this just because of my family, but Beresford did not loot. Soult was one of the great looters amongst the French generals. Beresford didn't aspire to a crown. Soult, for a while, aspired to a crown in Portugal.
Yes, he did.
Beresford missed Waterloo, and only because the Portuguese governors wouldn't release him and the Portuguese troops to go up to the Low Countries to fight.
Yeah.
Beresford was not a know-it-all, which some people accuse Soult of being a know-it-all. And Beresford wasn't very interested in politics. He did become the Master General in Wellington's government in the 1820s, and he did become the governor of Jersey and a number of other appointments. But he wasn't really into politics, where, of course, Soult was, and was a very successful post-war Minister for War and later Prime Minister of France. Soult was an extremely able general. I would be the first to say that, notwithstanding numerous defeats.
Indeed.
Napoleon referred to Soult as the best of all generals of Europe. So that was no mean accolade either, Now, Albuera was a defensive action for Beresford, but it was unlike any other major battle in the Peninsular War.
Yeah, indeed. So we're getting up to the battle now. On the way to Portugal to relieve some of the pressure off of Messina, Soult captures the important fortress of Badajoz on the border between Spain and Portugal. After Messina withdrew from Portugal, Wellington sent Beresford with an Anglo-Portuguese force to retake the town. Why do you think Wellington didn't go in person, or do you think he just implicitly trusted Beresford to get the job done?
Well, first of all, Soult had been campaigning in this part of the world since 1810, and he'd had a number of successes against Spanish armies. He'd seized Seville in February 1810, and in early 1811, he laid siege and took first Olivenza and then laid siege to Badajoz. Now, all the news coming to Wellington was that Badajoz could hold out. There was no immediate danger to it. But instead, Soult did take it under, shall we say, interesting circumstances. There were allegations that bribery had played a part, there'd been treason, all the rest of it. But in March 1811, Soult took Badajoz. Wellington took a calculated risk. He decided to split his army, and he sent the 2nd and 4th Divisions, together with a Portuguese division under Hamilton, with Beresford, down to Badajoz. So he had taken a large chunk out of his own army when Massena was still lurking up in northeastern Portugal on the Spanish border. Then, no sooner had he done that and Beresford started to march towards Badajoz than he called Beresford and the 4th Division back, because he suddenly realized that he thought that Massena was going to make a stand on the Portuguese border. As it happened, he didn't, and Beresford and Cole with the 4th Division were then sent to catch up the rest of the army. But it all took time to get down to Badajoz. On the way to Badajoz, Beresford captures Campo Mayor, which the French had captured only 10 days beforehand. And he then, in turn, recaptured Olivenza. He established a bridge of boats across the Guadiana River. And the Guadiana River is really important because it's the border between Spain and Portugal. And the fortress of Badajoz is actually then south of the Guadiana River in Spain. But anyhow, that is the basic request to go and recover Badajoz if he can. But Wellington, first of all, didn't give Beresford any siege equipment. I mean, this was a major miscalculation. There was no siege equipment which went down with him. And what happened was, eventually, they got some of the old guns out of Elvas, which is a Portuguese fortress on the Spanish frontier. And these guns were between 100 and 200 years old. And when they began the siege, no sooner did they begin the siege with them eventually, than the guns just started to explode.
Yeah, if there's one hole in Wellington's CV, he was not very good with sieges. And I think you make a great point there. Why would you send Beresford without siege weapons to retake a fortress town?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, it wasn't just Wellington. The British Army hadn't really a huge experience of sieges. They didn't go in for sieges, and when they did, they often employed foreigners to do them, you know? So it wasn't one of their strong points. But this campaign taught Wellington very well that he needed a proper siege train. And of course, that appears in its first instance at Ciudad Rodrigo in January 1812. And that is an amazing story in itself, how he got that siege train from Lisbon all the way to Ciudad Rodrigo without the French knowing.
Story for another time, but yes, it is
I'm
a good
afraid
one.
so. Yeah,
Yeah.
afraid so.
So the Allies laid siege to Badajoz. Now, Soult is not there. He's left the garrison. He's returned to Andalusia. But then he hears that Anglo-Portuguese forces marching to lay siege to Badajoz. So how many troops did each side have? First question. And then which nationalities formed the Allied army?
Well, I think we understand now that Beresford couldn't start with a siege. And what he did initially was a blockade. It was no more than a blockade of Badajoz. And he sent Colborne, who was one of his brigadier generals, he sent Colborne off into Extremadura towards Seville to cut the road between Badajoz and Seville, and also to liaise with some Spanish forces under Castaños who were out in the country but were rather feeling the heat from another of Soult's generals. So they sort of got a tenuous grip on the countryside around Badajoz, but it was merely a blockade. And Wellington realized very soon that to move the matter forward, he was going to require siege equipment or some approach that was unusual. And Wellington himself came to Elvas and to Albuera in April of that year. And he gave Beresford very precise instructions. In fact, Wellington did his normal thing. He micromanaged the situation. And he instructed Beresford on a number of things. First of all, he told him that if Soult came up from Seville, where he should fight the battle. So Wellington chose the battle site of Albuera, not Beresford. I think the second thing is that Wellington gave Beresford very specific instructions. Do not begin the siege of Badajoz until and unless the Spanish have signed up to a unified command. Remember, Wellington had had his problems with the Spaniards at Talavera, and he wasn't going to have those sort of problems again. Now, it was tricky because Castaños, the Spanish general, was actually the most senior military officer around. But Castaños was very magnanimous, and he turned around to Wellington and said, I think it would be appropriate for Beresford to command the unified army. And he sort of phased that with, well, the English have the most troops, so therefore Beresford should. Beresford's Anglo-Portuguese force, which he marched south with, was about 20,000, 18,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry. In addition, in the vicinity of Badajoz were Castaños with 3,000 and Ballesteros with about the same number, again another 3,000. They eventually come into the equation. They were screening Badajoz while the siege was in progress. Blake, who interestingly enough is of Irish descent, was coming up from southern Spain, numeric superiority of quite a considerable amount, 34,000 between these three armies, 20,000 in the Anglo-Portuguese, Blake's 8,500, Castaños 3,000, Ballesteros maybe 3,500. So that was 34,000. The French, the information that Beresford had was that Soult would have no more than 20,000. As it happened, he had about 24,000, including 4,000 cavalry, which gave him superiority in that area. So that's really the size of the armies, I think.
Okay. So Beresford learns of Soult's approach to Badajoz and marches to meet him, and the two armies collide at Albuera. You already mentioned that it's ideal terrain for a cavalry battle, but can you give us an idea of the layout of the battlefield?
Yeah, well, why Beresford fought there? Obviously, we've covered the fact that Wellington had chosen the battle site. If you have to fight, then you should only fight if you think you're going to win, Wellington said, and you should do so at Albuera. So, having heard that Soult was coming up with Seville very fast, Beresford raised the siege of Badajoz on the 12th of May, marched with his army, except for the 4th Division, which he left to fool the people in Badajoz. He left the 4th Division under Cole there for the moment. He marched with his army to Albuera, and he then went on to a place called Valverde, which is about 6 kilometers from Albuera, and he met Blake. And there they had their conference, their plan of campaign, if you like. And unfortunately, it became very difficult because Beresford's inclination was to retire back across his bridge of boats into Portugal and fight a defensive war if the French tried to come into Portugal. But Blake said that his army would disintegrate if he'd led them into Portugal. The Spanish and Portuguese, remember, were not good friends. And he would fight Soult alone if Beresford didn't stand with him. Well, the outcome of Blake's army fighting Soult was going to be a foregone conclusion. And Beresford determined that he must stand and fight at Albuera. Now, there were a number of other factors. Beresford, in truth, didn't want to abandon the siege of Badajoz if there was any prospect of that going forward. But also, there's something very interesting, which isn't often referred to in the history books. I mentioned that Beresford had the 2nd British Division with him. And it is alleged that the officers in the 2nd British Division pressured Beresford to stand and fight. And the reason they did so was because the 2nd Division had not been involved in Bussaco, had not had a share of the spoils, had not had a share of the laurels, and they were gung-ho. They wanted to get at these French.
Be careful. Be careful what you wish for when you want to get to the battle.
Exactly, exactly. So there were all these combinations, but ultimately Beresford decided to fight. And in fact, Albuera was a good site in one way because 5 roads converge in Albuera. But unfortunately, it was no Bussaco. It was low rolling hills.
Right. And I think that's what's interesting because you look at Spain and the terrain, for the most part, is terrible countryside for cavalry charges because it's so mountainous. Like there's no really flat area where you can go charging cavalry. And here we are at this little town, Albuera, and it's, like you said, low rolling hills.
Yeah, it appears that the village of Albuera, because it wasn't much more than a village in those days, was partially ruined already. Presumably somebody had passed through it and dealt it a blow or two, because the accounts, the contemporary accounts, describe some of the houses as ruined. But the village faced onto 2 streams which joined together just above the village. The river was perfectly fordable. It wasn't going to be a defensive line in itself. And behind the river, there were these low, sloping hills. Now, Beresford did try to put some of his troops on the reverse, but it wasn't the sort of place. It wasn't like Bussaco.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, let's discuss the battle now.
Mm.
Soult begins the battle by launching a strong, feint attack on the town of Albuera. What is his strategy and why did it work initially?
Well, Soult had this feint against the village coming straight over the bridge, over the river. But this was just a feint. And then his main attack was a left hook around the Allied right. And the objective, it was a very well thought out. The objective was to separate the British from the Spanish. If he could do that, that was great. Secondly, if he could get round behind the army, he would prevent Beresford being able to retreat into Portugal. And thirdly, if he could get Beresford caught between Badajoz and him, Beresford was going to get squeezed from both sides because, there was a French force in Badajoz. And so it was very well thought out in principle. And it's very interesting because less than, 10 days beforehand at Fuentes de Honoro, Massena had done exactly the same to Wellington. He had
That's right.
straight up into the town, first of all. And when that didn't work, in fact, he only did it when it didn't work, he tried the left hook and he nearly succeeded. I mean, Fuentes de Honoro, Wellington was in a lot of trouble and he extricated himself very well. And that was the genius of Wellington,
Yeah. And that is a classic Napoleonic move, pin them in the middle and then send a left hook or a right hook around the other
Yeah,
side with the main
yeah,
force. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, the French, as you mentioned, launched their main attack under General Gerard, not the
yeah.
future Marshal Gerard. That's a different Gerard. General
Mhm.
Gerard on the Allied right where the Spanish were positioned. How did this attack go and how did Beresford respond to it?
Yeah, the battle began about 9 o'clock in the morning. What had happened was that Blake's army, despite promises from Blake that he would be with Beresford in Albuera at midday on the 15th, didn't turn up till the middle of the night. And there was a lot of confusion. But Beresford placed the Spanish on the right of his line, which was facing the river. So when the French hook came in, it was going to hit the Spaniards. Now, Beresford realized, because he saw, first of all, that Godinot was leading the French division straight across the bridge. And behind him was what appeared to be Werle's division. But Werle had only sent his grenadiers. And either Beresford or one of his ADCs noticed that the rest of Werle's division was heading off to the left. And then they began to see that there was quite a movement to the left. And Beresford told Blake to swing his army round so that it would, instead of being a straight line, it would be at a right angle. So if the French came at them, they were going to have to hit the whole of the Spanish army. Blake was not convinced. He thought the main attack was still coming straight across the river, and he didn't do much about it. But luckily for Beresford and luckily for the Allies, one of the Spanish commanders, Zayas, did react quickly. And he moved his 4 regiments immediately over to the right. He actually says that I saw the French bayonets glistening in the sun, and I realized this must be happening. Meanwhile, Beresford had gone off to find the Portuguese who were on his left. So you've got at Albuera, you've got the British in the centre, Portuguese on the left, Spanish on the right. Beresford goes off to tell the Portuguese to come in towards the centre. When he comes back, he finds that Blake hasn't done what he asked him. And there are quite sharp words, I understand. And Blake still isn't really convinced, but he does begin to move the troops. But the result of this is, of course, that Zayas's 4 regiments, with Ballesteros, who actually came in as well. Ballesteros is 3,000, but they face the might of not 1, but 2 French divisions, Girard and Gazin right behind him. And
Right.
they stand there and take it. I mean, these
Yeah,
Spaniards are magnificent, and they must be
I know.
mentioned.
I agree, and I wanted to point that out. Far too many times in the Peninsular War, the Spanish army gets a bad rap, and to me, they were just poorly led. They were actually good soldiers. Zayas does a great job, as you mentioned, with the help of the British. The Spanish line holds on that precarious right side of their flank. What happens to Colborne's brigade?
Well, it couldn't last. I mean, Spanish courage is one thing, but it couldn't last. The weight of numbers was beginning to tell. So Beresford asks or orders Stuart, who commands the 2nd Division, to send 1 brigade initially, and perhaps 2 brigades eventually, over to support the Spaniards. So Stuart has 3 brigades. The 1st Brigade is under Colborne, moves across immediately. And then the 2nd Brigade under Houghton moves across to support him. And for a while, they cause a lot of problems to the French. And the 3rd Brigade from Stuart then moves as well and enfilades some of the French from their right, the Spanish left. But what happens is that the weather deteriorates. There's a lot of smoke, a lot of rain, a lack of visibility. And because Stuart does something which he was criticized for afterwards, and I suppose fairly criticized, probably because he thought there wasn't time, but he doesn't allow the British regiments to get into squares or columns, and they straggle over. So when the French cavalry hit them, they are totally unprepared for it. And the French cavalry on this occasion are the Vistula Lancers, and they are Polish lancers who are fighting for the French. Napoleon had done a very crafty thing. He promised the Poles that he would give them back a kingdom. Poland had been dismembered by the Russians, the Austrians, and the Prussians at this stage. But he promised the Polish people that they would get back a kingdom. He had all these Polish troops, infantry regiments and cavalry, and the Lancers were so effective at this battle and at subsequent battles that, in fact, the British Army, only after the war, began to introduce Lancer regiments into the British Army.
Yeah.
Now, the Lancers got in behind Colborne's brigade and Houghton's brigade, and they really caused a lot of trouble. The losses were horrendous. In fact, they got so far that they got to Beresford's almost headquarters at one stage, and one of the paintings that you'll see painted of the Battle of Albuera is Beresford pulling a Polish lancer off his horse. Now, Beresford was known for his prodigious strength. He was a big guy, and
Yeah.
the poor Polish lancer, he gets pulled off the horse. He then gets up with his lance to try and jab Beresford. But unfortunately for him, one of Beresford's ADC disposes of this poor lancer. But it is part of the battle history, so to speak.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. As you mentioned, Colborne's brigade is kind of ripped to shreds by the French and Polish cavalry, which threatened to roll up the whole British army under Beresford. So how did the British and Spanish maintain their discipline in line? I know the British are famous for it, but that must have been a very scary moment in the battle where it could have turned either way.
Yeah. I mean, two British regiments suffered in particular there. The 3rd, which were known as the Buffs, and that was because of the colour of the facings on their uniform. They suffered horrendously. And the 57th, who became known as the Diehards, because their mortally wounded Colonel Inglis, kept shouting, "Die hard, die hard," as they were fighting on. In fact, a slightly interesting story about the Diehards, about the 57th Regiment, is there was a very young drummer boy there, Henry Holloway, and he was there, and he was still alive in 1888 and living in Kent in England. And the 57th Regiment happened to be marching past where he lived. And they stopped, and the entire regiment saluted him. So there you are. 75 years after the battle, the regiment still remembered. Henry Holloway, a young drummer boy, probably 10 or 12 years old, was remembered all those years later, you know?
That's amazing. Yeah, that's a band of brothers right there.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, the line holds, and meanwhile, Gerard's main attack division is suffering horrendous casualties just from infantry firing kind of point blank at each other.
Yeah,
And Gerard considers his force to be a spent force, so he brings up Gazan's second division to take its place.
yeah.
And the ensuing disruption and lull kind of allows the Allies to regain their footing, correct?
Well, this is part of the story where some of the Spaniards don't perform as well. And Beresford tries to get Carlos de España's brigade to move forward. They're behind the line, and they refuse to do so. And some of the accounts refer to Beresford manhandling one of the officers to try and make an example of him. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But Carlos de España's regiment wouldn't move forward, or regiments. And it is thought that this is because the French had made them suffer so badly at the Battle of Albuera back in February 1811 that they were unwilling to take them on again. But it certainly caused a difficulty for Beresford because these were the next fresh troops in line, if you like. When that doesn't work, Beresford sends one of his Major Arbuthnot off to get the Portuguese from the left hand because they're not engaged at all. There's nothing happening on the left hand side of the battlefield. There's a whole Portuguese division there. And Beresford sends Arbuthnot off, who's his military secretary, in fact, to go and collect the Portuguese and bring them forward. Now, we don't quite know what happened, and possibly because Arbuthnot doesn't reappear at this stage, Beresford himself goes walkabout. Now, maybe that's something he shouldn't have done, but he seems to have gone to look for the Portuguese. And while this is all happening, Beresford's adjutant general, Harding, joins Cole, who's appeared. Cole had marched on the night before the battle from Badajoz and was up on the top of the hill. He was the reserve. He had, I think, 6,000 men in the reserve there. And Cole had been given instructions by Beresford not to move. And the reason for that was that Cole was protecting the retreat if he needed to retreat into Portugal. But Harding goes up to Cole, and there's some, again, dispute about all these things as to whose idea it was. But Harding says that he persuaded Cole that Cole must now move forward, even though he hasn't got any instructions from Beresford. Cole moves his division, the 4th Division, down in echelon. The French cavalry, the heavy cavalry, now comes in, as well as the lancers, and attacks them. And Cole's division, this is the 4th Division, has both Portuguese regiments and British regiments in it. The heavy cavalry cannot break them. And they march down, and Soult realizes the trouble he is in, and now brings Verles's whole division in to play. But they can make nothing. They are forced backwards by the 4th Division, and eventually Soult realizes the game is up and tells his boys to retreat.
Yeah, and I think as the battle went longer and longer, and Soult knew he didn't have as many troops as the Allies did, he knew the game was up. Both flanks and center are holding against the French onslaught. Soult reluctantly orders the retreat, famously saying, quote, "There is no beating these troops, in spite of their generals. I always thought they were bad soldiers. Now I'm sure of it. I had turned their right, pierced their center. Everywhere victory was mine, but they did not know how to run." End quote. Were the British in any condition to pursue Soult's retreating army?
Well, first of all, this is a popular quotation. And I don't know whether you know where it originally came from, but I haven't been able to find it. It's in a whole lot of secondary sources, and it sounds like a sort of thing that Soult would make up later, because it's nothing like that in his battle report. Now, his battle report itself was optimistic enough. It was trying to tell Napoleon that he'd done a rather good job. He'd originally said his purpose in going to Badajoz was to relieve the siege, the British siege of Badajoz. But he turns it around, and he now presents in his report that his success at having driven the British out of Extremadura, out of this part of Spain. Well, in fact, that hadn't happened either. So I don't know. There are various variations on that quotation you've just read me. In fact, one I did find was they were completely beaten, the day was mine, and they didn't know it and would not run. I've never found the original of that. And so if any of your listeners or readers do know it, please let me know. I'd be delighted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it's apocryphal. Who knows? But
Now, I think your question was, were the British in any stage to follow the French? Technically, yes, because Beresford still had his Portuguese division unused. He had independent Portuguese brigades unused. He had quite a few Spanish regiments which hadn't entered the fray. We've discussed them. And he had a brigade which had been caught on the wrong side of the River Guadiana at Badajoz and only arrived the day after the battle, Kemmis's brigade. So he did probably have quite a large number of troops, which he could. But what he did do was he reinstated the siege of Badajoz immediately in case the French came out or anybody tried to get supplies into them. So he actually sent his Portuguese division off to reinstate the siege of Badajoz, and he sent his own cavalry after the French. And there were quite a few engagements as the French retreated, including one at Usagre 2 or 3 days later, where quite a lot of French prisoners were taken. So that was quite successful.
Well, I think it's interesting. I just did an episode on the Battle of Eylau. And sometimes you don't realize how bad a battle is until you get the casualty reports from your commanders from all the areas of the field. And you're like, whoa, I didn't know we lost that many troops. What were the casualties on both sides?
Well, the French lost between 8 and 10,000. Again, Soult in his, I was going to say his post-match report, but you know what I mean,
Yeah.
his post-battle report, he tried to pretend otherwise. He said, I've only lost 2,800. But this was exposed by his own chief of staff, Mockere, who in his report listed 5,900 and something. So immediately the figure was more than doubled. And General Gazin, in writing back to France, put it at between 8 and 10,000. So one way or another, Soult had lost between 40 and 50% of his force. Now, if you look on the Allied side of the equation, they'd suffered 6,000 killed or wounded. And what caused the hullabaloo, of course, was that of that 6,000, 4,000 were British troops. And
Right.
that was a very large number of British troops to lose. I mean, not all killed, but killed or wounded, you know.
Yeah. And I know Wellington had standing orders from London like, look, this is our only army. Don't lose it.
Yeah,
Don't let it
yeah,
get torn up.
yeah.
So I know Wellington was very unhappy with the battle report from Beresford saying, quote, this won't do. It will drive the people in England mad. Write me down a victory, end quote. So I have two questions, I guess. Who won the battle, if anyone? And what was Wellington's assessment of Beresford's performance?
The
Sure.
Spaniards had lost about 1,500 men, and the
Okay.
Portuguese only about 400 men. That makes up the 6,000. But if you look at just the British casualties, then there are other encounters in the peninsula where they lost more. Because at Talavera, there were over 5,000 British casualties. And at the second siege of Badajoz, or the third siege by somebody's calculations in 1812, again, the British lost over 4,000 of their own troops. So it was a sanguinary, I'm not trying to say it wasn't a sanguinary conflict. It was, and the British losses were horrific at the battle.
I think Beresford somewhat got caught with his pants down, but I give him great credit that he fixed the situation as best he could.
Exactly. I mean, Beresford was no Wellington. I'm not pretending he was. But, you know, Wellington arrives down in Elvas on the 19th of May. That's 3 days after the battle. And Beresford had been asking him to come down because he was really worried long before the battle. But, of course, Wellington himself had fought the Battle of Fuentes de Onoro. And then he had also suffered what was a very embarrassing incident, which was the escape of the French garrison from Almeida, which he felt was one of the worst outcomes and disasters of the war himself. But anyhow, he's very supportive of Beresford, and I've just got a couple of quotes here. And he says, you could not be successful in such an action without a large loss, and we must make up our minds to affairs of this kind sometimes or give up the game, he says. So, but I think Beresford actually was suffering PTSD almost. He was absolutely horrified by the number of casualties. And he doesn't have a nervous breakdown, but he's not the same man for 3 or 4 months afterwards. Certainly not. I mean, he goes back to Lisbon. He has to do some serious work with the Portuguese army and the loyal Lusitanian Legion and integrating it in the army. And there's a whole lot of things he has to do. And Wellington's very happy for him to do that. But I actually do feel he was suffering some sort of nervous setback. Whether it's PTSD as we now know it or not, I don't know. But he writes to Wellington, says, look, I'm really in doubt. I don't know whether I should have fought this battle or not. And I really have serious concerns. But if you just look at the subsequent events, Wellington does not lose faith in Beresford at all. You know, there's a lot of discussion about second in command and who was the right hand of Wellington and all that. Remember, Beresford had only been given this command because Hill was ill and had to go back to England. And he was given this command because Wellington was concerned. I mean, first of all, he had faith in Beresford, but it was only temporary. It was expressed as a temporary command. When Hill came back, he was always going to take over the second division again. But from time to time afterwards, the matter of who should succeed Wellington does crop up, you know? And throughout the war, Beresford remains not only in command of the Portuguese army, but he fights alongside Wellington in all the major battles of the war. And indeed, in a number of those battles, he leads the attack at Nivelles, at Orthez, and at Toulouse. So he remains a close confidant of Wellington. And, you know, you just have to look at Wellington's letters. One of them, he writes to Charles Stewart, the British minister plenipotentiary in Lisbon. Wellington writes to him and he says, "It's impossible for two people to understand each other better than Beresford and I. He's 2 miles from this place, and I see him every day, and I believe that we take pretty nearly the same view on every transaction." And then, of course, the question does arise, as I say, about who would succeed Wellington if he suffers some mishap. Wellington's quotes in his correspondence and what he did say or didn't say to his various generals. And he says, there's this one, he says, summarized to members of his staff. "If it was a question of handling troops, some of you fellows might do as well. Nay, better than he. But what we want now is someone to feed the troops, and I know no one better for the purpose than Beresford." And then he writes to Bathurst, the Minister for War in 1813, the British Minister for War, and he says, "I never doubted about the succession of that officer to the command when I should be gone." That officer is Beresford. And then he says, "All that I can tell you is that the ablest man I've yet seen with the army, and the one with the largest views, is Beresford. They tell me that when I'm not present, he wants decision. And he certainly embarrassed me a little with his doubts when he commanded in Estremadura. But I am quite certain that he is the only person capable of conducting a large concern." So that's, you know, pretty good praise from the leading general of his day.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess that's my final question is, what is the legacy of Albuera? Because it's not a Vittoria or a Salamanca or even a Waterloo. It's not a clinching battle of any kind. It's like an Eylau or a Borodino. It's a bloodletting.
Well, there's short terms and long term legacy, I suppose. The short term legacy is that every village and town in the locality is filled up with hospitals, temporary hospitals. And indeed, Beresford sets up, and I'd like just to give a shout out for this, he sets up what becomes the British cemetery in Elvas, the British military cemetery in Elvas, and that still exists. And every year in May, there are commemorations there. And it is extraordinary because people turn up, descendants of people who fought and sometimes died at Albuera still turn up over 200 years later for those commemorations, for those ceremonies. I mean, we all understand why people turn up from the Second World War or the Korean War. It's very close, you know, but this is 200 years ago, and there are still people coming up to Elvas every May to go to these ceremonies. I just urge any of your followers, if they're in the region, to look at Elvas and consider going in May, because it's a very interesting time. Now, long term, as I said, they've resumed the siege of Badajoz, which Wellington takes charge of. But it's no more successful than the first siege because he doesn't have the guns. And of course, the French, they had this remarkable ability, certainly in the early and middle years of the war, to recover very quickly. And Marmont comes south with an army. He's succeeded Massena. He comes south with an army, and Soult comes north. They coalesce, and they've got a larger force than Wellington. So Wellington lifts the siege and retires into Portugal. So the second siege was no more successful than the first so-called siege, which was really a blockade. Outcome of the battle? Well, they had prevented a French incursion into Portugal, which by Mortier or by Soult, which was a very real possibility, and of course, which Massena had been wishing for months to draw forces away from his own situation. I think, though, 1811 is important, and people overlook it, because combined with the Battle of Fuentes de Honoro, this Battle of Albuera, drove the French out of Portugal. They never returned. I mean, there was slight little incursions, but they never returned in any force in 1811. The country was now rid of Napoleon's armies. And I think that's really important. Both battles had been fought to prevent the relief of a siege, as it happens, and both had achieved that result in the short term. So I think 1811 can be regarded and should be regarded as a turning point in the war. Now, there are many turning points, and I'm not saying it's the be all and end all, but I do think you discount the outcome of those battles in 1811 at your peril.
Yeah, I agree. And I think when you don't get what you want, which was a victory, you get experience. And they got experience in learning how to defeat the French, whether it was Marshal Soult or Massena, which would provide fruit for 1812 at Salamanca and 1813 in Vittoria. You learn what the French strategies are, and then you can
Yeah,
apply them to later battles. Maybe that's the legacy. It's a hard one to
yeah.
pin down, but you're right. It should get more attention than it does.
And Wellington learnt that he needed a siege train.
Yeah, yeah, that too. Well, thank you for that, Marcus. That was wonderful. Again, Marcus has some really interesting biographies I'd like for my listeners to check out. One on obviously Marshal Beresford, another one on Dennis Pack. And please go to Peninsular Publishing or the Irish Academic Press to find those. And yeah, we thank you for your time, my friend.
It's been a real pleasure, and I really enjoy your podcast. I think you're doing a great job, John.
You're too kind, but thank you for saying that. And yeah, we hope to have Marcus back on the show soon. Thank you so much, sir.